She left just before sunrise, like she always did. A quiet morning jog to the whispering trails of Napa Valley, her place of peace. But on March 18th, 2018, Veronica Hensley didn't come back. Her car was still there, engine cold. Her phone gone. No footprints, no calls, no screams. Just silence, as if she had stepped into the woods and vanished into air. For 2 years, the forest held its secrets. Search parties found nothing. Her family clung to hope that grew thinner by the season. But everything changed because of a pig. A retired chef's truffle pig, trained to root out delicacies, began clawing a forgotten patch of dirt in the woods. And beneath it, pieces of a story the world had almost forgotten. Veronica Lynn Hensley was 27, a track star in high school, a local running coach by trade. She lived alone in a modest cottage in St. Helena, disciplined to a fault. She ran the same trail loop every morning before work, an 8-mile stretch starting from the concrete trailhead just off Silverado Trail Road. She wasn't someone who missed routines. Her alarm would buzz at 5:15 a.m., coffee by 5:25, laces tied by 5:35, jogging by 5:45. She'd even text her boyfriend, Aiden, every morning before she set off. On the day she vanished, her message was simple: heading out now, back soon. Time stamped at 5:47 a.m. It was the last anyone heard from her. By 7:30, Aiden began to worry. By 8:15, he was at the trailhead. Veronica's car was there, neatly parked. Windows intact. Doors locked. Her phone and keys were missing, along with the hydration belt she always wore. At first, he convinced himself she'd taken a longer route or stopped to help someone. But by noon, he called police. The search was immediate and thorough. At least it appeared to be. Napa County Search and Rescue brought in dogs, drones, thermal cameras. They canvassed the woods in shifts. Helicopters scoured the ridgelines. Locals volunteered in waves. But it was spring. The foliage had returned. Dense undergrowth made many parts of the trail inaccessible. The ground was soft, disturbed by wildlife, and more than 400 acres of trail system made the job almost impossible. After 5 days, the search scaled back. Flyers were stapled to trees, taped to gas pumps, pinned to cafe walls. Her parents pleaded for help on local news. Tips trickled in. None led anywhere. One lead mentioned a white van parked near Oakville Grade around 6 a.m. A driver reported seeing a woman running, and then being stopped by someone. Police checked surveillance. The van appeared 2 hours later, in a completely different part of the county. False lead. Another caller said they heard a scream in the forest that morning. Too vague. No timestamp. No location. Slowly, the momentum died. By the 6-month mark, investigators started looking at other possibilities. Did Veronica leave by choice? Did she get injured and crawl out of range? Or did someone close to her know more than they were admitting? They searched her phone records, scoured her bank statements, even reviewed private therapy notes. Nothing alarming. Her last purchases were groceries. Her final texts were routine. Her calendar was filled with running appointments and personal coaching sessions. There was no digital breadcrumb trail. No red flags. Just a woman gone. By early 2019, the case had quietly been downgraded to inactive. There were still open files and case notes, but no new leads. Her parents tried to keep public interest alive, organizing jogs in her name, holding candlelight vigils. But it felt like everyone else had moved on. Then came March 2020, the second anniversary of Veronica's disappearance. The mood at that year's memorial was different, more subdued, less press. But one thing remained unchanged, her mother's unwavering hope. 3 weeks after that vigil, an unexpected discovery broke the silence. Caleb Bryant was not a detective. He was not a runner. He had no connection to the case. He was, however, a retired chef from San Francisco who had moved to Napa for peace and truffles. Caleb had a prized possession, his truffle pig, Maybelline, gifted to him by a friend in Oregon. She was trained to sniff out edible gold beneath the soil. Together, they roamed lesser-known trails, looking for fungi to sell to upscale restaurants. That April morning, they wandered beyond the usual routes. Maybelline stopped near a dense section of undergrowth, just off a faded path that had become overgrown since the 2018 wildfires. She sniffed, circled, then began furiously digging. Caleb expected mushrooms. What he saw instead turned his stomach. There, beneath the earth, were fabric fragments and bone. One piece had a small pink flower print. Another was unmistakably nylon, a torn running belt. Caleb called 911 immediately. By nightfall, the area was sealed off. Forensic experts were brought in. Over the next 3 days, they uncovered a shallow grave roughly 3 feet deep. Inside were partial remains, bits of clothing, and a cracked pink wristwatch that had stopped at 6:08 a.m. Dental records confirmed what everyone feared. Veronica Hensley had been found. The news shook the community. Suddenly, everything that had been whispered behind closed doors, the theories, the suspicions, became real. A homicide investigation was officially reopened, but even with the body discovered, the clues were few. There was no murder weapon, no clear signs of trauma, at least not initially. The body was too decomposed for traditional autopsy results to offer certainty. Her watch had stopped, but no one could say if it was damaged during the attack, buried in error, or simply failed with time. More disturbing still, the area where she was found had allegedly been searched during the original operation. So how had they missed it? Or worse, had her body been moved there after the fact? The sheriff's office began reviewing their 2018 interviews. They rechecked anyone who had crossed paths with Veronica, clients, running groups, neighbors. And soon one name resurfaced, a man who had been questioned and quietly dismissed early in the case. Someone with a record, someone who knew those woods better than anyone, someone who had a history that no one had fully explored. He first appeared in the margins of the original investigation, a name scribbled onto a field interview sheet. No arrest, no detainment, just a brief conversation during the earliest phase of the search. At the time, it didn't raise flags. But now, 2 years later, that name had come back with sharper edges. Thomas Elwood Rayner, 56 years old, former park ranger, loner, quiet, lived in a trailer off Hollow Creek Road, less than 5 miles from the Con Creek trailhead where Veronica disappeared. Back in 2018, Thomas told investigators he was birdwatching the morning she vanished. He claimed he hadn't seen anyone unusual. No running woman, no struggle, no strange vehicles. He even offered his binoculars as proof, still strung around his neck during questioning. And that was it. The officers logged a statement, thanked him, and moved on. But in 2020, when Veronica's remains were unearthed, detectives took a second look, and what they saw wasn't just suspicious. It was deeply troubling. Thomas had resigned from the Park Service in 2015 after an internal disciplinary report accused him of inappropriate conduct with a female hiker. The details had been buried in bureaucracy. No formal charges, just quiet paperwork and a mutual agreement to transition out. After his resignation, he went off-grid, bought a second-hand trailer, and parked it deep into county land near Hollow Creek. No family, no job, no online presence. But he never fully left the trails. Multiple hikers remembered seeing him in the months after Veronica's disappearance. Same hat, same flannel shirt, same silent stare as he watched people from a distance. At the time, no one thought much of it. The woods had always drawn solitary types. Thomas just blended in. But detectives now noticed something else. His proximity. Veronica's body had been found just 0.8 miles from Thomas's trailer, a portion of the trail only a few locals knew about. It wasn't even on the public maps. That changed everything. Detectives secured a warrant and searched Thomas's trailer on April 14th, 2020. What they found sent a ripple through the case file. Inside the rusting trailer was a room filled with stacks of field journals, rows of dated entries, all written in neat, looping handwriting. He had documented years of daily forest activity, animal patterns, hiker sightings, weather. But one entry stood out. March 18th, 2018, 5:44 a.m. Runner, female, alone, red hydration belt, pace 7 mph, took trail split toward Fern Path, followed for a quarter mile, lost sight near Ridge Point, crows active overhead, fog patch light. The timestamp matched the moment Veronica began her run, and while it didn't confess to anything, it placed him exactly where police hadn't looked closely enough. A watcher, a recorder, an observer of a jogger who never returned. Still, police needed more. The journals were circumstantial. The trailer had no blood, no clothing, no weapon, just obsession in ink. Then came the wildlife cam footage. The forestry department had begun installing motion-activated cameras in late 2017 to monitor wildfire regrowth. They weren't security cams, and they weren't well known, but one had captured something odd. On March 18, 2018, at 6:16 a.m., 8 minutes after Veronica's watch had stopped, a man could be seen dragging something to the brush near Ridge Point. The image was grainy, partially obscured by fog, but the silhouette was tall, lean, and carried what looked like a rolled tarp. The man wore a flannel shirt and a Ranger-style cap, the same shirt Thomas had been wearing during his original police interview. When officers confronted him with the footage, Thomas was quiet. He didn't deny it was him. He just said, "It's the woods. I take care of what people leave behind." Cryptic, almost mocking. They arrested him that evening. But even in custody, Thomas gave them nothing. No confession, no panic, just silence. He refused to answer questions about Veronica. He asked for a public defender and sat motionless during booking. Meanwhile, the DA's office was divided. They had a location, a witness trail, journal entries, suspicious behavior, and proximity, but they didn't have a smoking gun, no DNA, no eyewitness to the crime, and a timeline with enough room for doubt. What they did have, however, was pattern. While combing through Thomas's journals, investigators noticed other names. Some were vague: blonde girl, yellow tank, dog. Others had initials, and one had a full name: A.S. Cried near Fern Path 2013. Detectives pulled missing persons records from the region. One file matched that entry almost perfectly. Abigail Stowe, 22, vanished while hiking Fern Path in May 2013. Her dog was found 3 days later, wandering alone. Her case had gone cold years ago. Another set of initials matched a different disappearance from 2011, each with the same eerie theme. Young women, solo hikes, the same general area. The dates corresponded to entries in Thomas's journals. He hadn't just been watching. He'd been tracking. Forensic analysts re-examined the shallow grave where Veronica had been found. This time, they dug wider, past the original boundary, and 4 feet from the main burial, they found something else. A rusted camping knife. The blade was dulled, weather-worn, but lodged in the hinge was a small, fibrous thread, red, synthetic, the same material as Veronica's hydration belt. DNA testing confirmed blood, traces, matching Veronica's profile. It was enough to press charges. Thomas Elwood Rayner was officially charged with first-degree murder on May 8, 2020. The indictment also included new investigations into 2 additional cold cases. Abigail Stowe and another unidentified woman found partially buried in a similar forest area years prior. The trial date was set, but Thomas still wouldn't speak. Not to detectives, not to lawyers, not even during arraignment. He stared straight ahead, jaw locked, eyes distant. And then, out of nowhere, he sent a letter. The letter was postmarked from the county jail, addressed not to court, but to Veronica's mother, Lynn Hensley. Inside was a single sentence written in the same cursive as his journals. She was running towards something she'd never reach. No signature, no apology, just cryptic closure, or cruelty disguised as poetry. Lynn handed it straight to prosecutors. It was deemed admissible, though its meaning remained. The maps didn't look like much at first. Torn notebook paper, each yellow by time and humidity, stacked in the corner of Thomas Rayner's trailer beneath a pile of dusty ranger brochures. Dozens of them, some detailed winding trails. Others just had coordinates. None had labels. They were hand-drawn in pen, but not randomly. He had measured distances, sketched elevations, labeled tree patterns. And in the corner of each page, always the same thing, a single red X. No one knew how many X's there were, only that the further detectives looked, the more they found. The DA's office hadn't planned on trying this as a serial case. That changed the moment the forensic team analyzed those hand sketch maps and cross-referenced them with historical missing persons data. 3 of the red X's were within a few meters of previously documented disappearances, cases that had gone cold years ago, and 2 others, completely unknown to authorities. One led to a burial site so remote and overgrown it took 4 days and a drone team to locate it. When they did, they found the remains of a young woman. No ID, no shoes, no clothing, just bones and a cheap, heart-shaped necklace buried in the dirt. The courtroom was quiet the day Thomas Rayner was let in. It had been 2 years since his arrest and nearly 4 since Veronica Hensley disappeared. Now, the world would hear everything, from the jog through concrete to the journals, the wildlife cam, the DNA on the blade, and now the maps. It wasn't just about Veronica anymore. It was about how long he'd been doing this, and how no one had stopped him. The prosecution called their first witness, Detective Cara Hollis. Calm, seasoned, and the lead on the 2020 break in the case. She recounted how the 2018 investigation had interviewed Thomas, but let him go due to lack of evidence. Did you at any point, during the initial search, believe Thomas Rayner was capable of murder? The prosecutor asked. No, Hollis admitted, but I believe now he was counting on that. Then came the journals, then the maps, then the wildlife cam still frame. Piece by piece, a man once seen as a harmless recluse was painted as a meticulous predator, one who didn't stalk in rage, but in ritual. Thomas's defense team, 2 court-appointed attorneys, stuck to one strategy, reasonable doubt. No confession, no eyewitnesses, just implication by proximity. They argued that the journal entries were merely the writings of a lonely man observing his world, that the footage was blurry, that the blade was old, and that the X marks on the maps could have been anything, game sightings, mushroom clusters, even favorite spots. But when the prosecution brought in Dr. Elise Jordan, a behavioral profiler from Quantico, the tone shifted. She described Thomas's writings as indicative of what's known as a passive hunter-predator, one who waits, watches, documents patterns, then acts with surgical precision. He wasn't stalking to react, she explained. He was planning to eliminate, with intention and without remorse. Then came the most devastating testimony. Lynn Hensley, Veronica's mother. The courtroom fell to a hush as she walked to the witness stand holding the letter Thomas had sent her. Still folded, still cryptic. She read it aloud. She was running towards something she'd never reach. And then she looked directly at him. She wasn't running toward something, Lynn said, her voice trembling. She was running away from you. Thomas didn't blink. He didn't look at her. He just sat there expressionless. But something flickered in his eyes for just a second. Not remorse. Satisfaction. On the 7th day of trial, the prosecution dropped a bombshell. A second journal, previously misfiled, had been recovered from evidence. Inside were entries going back to 2010. And in one, dated April 9th, 2013, was this line. She screamed. Didn't expect the knife. Buried near shale rocks. Took necklace for the box. The forensic team re-examined the necklace found at the remote burial site. Etched faintly on the clasp was a date, March 17th, 11, a common graduation gift. Records showed that Casey Landon, a 19-year-old who vanished during spring break that same year, had received a heart-shaped pennant from her parents engraved with that exact date. She had never been found until now. Thomas Rayner was now linked through journals to 4 deaths. Prosecutors amended the charges to include 3 counts of first-degree murder, with a 4th held pending further remains identification. The courtroom knew then this wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a slow unraveling of a predator's private kingdom, a place where no one could hear you scream, where footprints vanished behind you, and where silence wasn't peace. It was bait, and still, Thomas refused to speak. Not a word in his own defense. Not to deny, not to explain. But then, in the middle of testimony on day 11, he did something unexpected. While a former ranger colleague was describing Thomas's uncanny knowledge of animal migration trails, he turned to the jury and whispered something under his breath. Reporters in the front row caught it. Just 4 words. There are more maps. Security was heightened. A second search warrant was issued for the trailer and surrounding woods. And tucked behind a rotted floor panel, police discovered what could only be described as an archive. More maps, more drawings, more journal entries, some written in code, and a shoebox filled with small objects, trinkets, bracelets, and even a cracked runner's watch stopped at 6:08 a.m. The time Veronica's GPS signal had the shoebox changed everything. Until then, the prosecution had been working with theory, educated guesses, behavioral profiles, maps without context. But this box, retrieved from a compartment beneath a loose floorboard in Thomas Rayner's trailer, made things terrifyingly real. Inside were 13 items, none larger than a fist, each labeled with a date. A cracked runner's watch stopped at 6:08 a.m., a girl's silver earring missing its twin, a plastic charm from a child's keychain, and at the bottom of the box, folded neatly like an old receipt, was a tooth fairy note written in a child's shaky handwriting. The courtroom hadn't even seen the worst yet. The jury room was silent when the evidence was displayed. No one spoke. One juror, a mother of 2, had to excuse herself in tears. Another clenched his fists, knuckles white. These weren't trinkets. They were trophies, mementos from victims no one had ever reported missing, because some of them were too young to be alone, or too forgotten to raise alarms, or too far from home for anyone to connect the dots. One item dated back to 1997, which meant Thomas Rayner had possibly been doing this for nearly 3 decades. But the question that haunted prosecutors wasn't just how long he'd been killing. It was how he'd hidden it so well. The national forest spanned hundreds of square miles. It was a hiker's dream and an investigator's nightmare. Between seasonal tourists, undocumented campers, and vagabonds moving through, disappearances weren't unheard of. And Thomas? He knew the forest better than anyone, not just the map trails, but the animal paths, the dried stream beds, the decaying cabins no one else dared enter. He could blend into the trees like moss, vanish from view like a shadow. Then came the final twist no one expected. During a cross-examination of Ranger Joseph Beckley, who had worked with Thomas in the late 90s, the defense asked a peculiar question. Did Mr. Rayner ever report suspicious activity on park grounds? Beckley nodded. Once, around 2002, said he saw a man burying something in the ravine near Switchback Ridge. Did you investigate? Briefly, Beckley admitted, but it was off-season. We didn't find anything. Figured he was chasing shadows. Did he describe the man? Beckley hesitated. Yeah, tall, ponytail, had a limp. A ripple went through the courtroom, because that same description, tall, ponytail, limp, matched the suspect from a 2001 missing persons case, filed 2 counties over. The man was never charged. And the victim, 23-year-old Melanie Cruz, was never found. The theory shattered everything. What if Thomas wasn't acting alone? What if he hadn't started this? What if, at least once, he'd been a witness, not the predator? And what if something about that encounter in 2002 didn't horrify him, but inspired him? The FBI was called in to reassess the case. Behavioral analysts reviewed the journals again, this time not just as the ramblings of a solitary killer, but possibly the playbook of an apprentice who later surpassed his teacher. Some entries seemed instructional. Shovel deeper where soil is clay. Wait for moonless nights. Bones rot fast in near creeks, but they don't disappear. One particularly chilling entry read, "I used to dream about watching. Now I dream about silence after." By the third week of trial, media dubbed the case the Forrest Ledger. TV panels speculated if Thomas Rainer was the next Zodiac, a recluse with secrets, codes, and crimes spanning decades. Online sleuths poured through unsolved hiking and camping disappearances. A Reddit thread cross-mapped the red excess from the recovered drawings to a disturbing number of open cases between 1995 and 2015. But it was map number 14 that caused the most unease. It pointed to a stretch of overgrown brush near what used to be the Skybridge Fire Lookout, now defunct. Search teams went in, and what they found weren't just bones. They found a second box, this one wrapped in plastic, buried deep beneath a collapsed chimney. Inside were more trinkets, items not belonging to Thomas's confirmed victims, which meant at least one other person had used this hiding place before. And then came the letter, addressed to Jr., dated 1999, signed only C. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive, but the message was clear. If you bury where the chimney is, it's warm enough year-round. No one patrols that far in fire season. Tell no one, and never twice in the same month. Thomas Rainer denied ever receiving it, but prosecutors believed otherwise. Jr. James Rainer was Thomas's full name. The mystery person, C, was still out there. Back in court, Thomas sat still, unshaken. He didn't flinch when they showed the new evidence. Didn't react when his defense team tried to argue proved others had used the woods for similar crimes. Because Thomas didn't care who got credit. He cared that they found the maps, that someone had finally read the ledger. And deep down, investigators feared this was a game all along, to lead them into his forest, to make them see what he saw, to finally be heard. When closing arguments came, the room was full. Reporters, victim families, forest rangers, and FBI observers from 3 states. The prosecution said it plainly. This wasn't an impulsive crime. This was a blueprint, a life of planning, watching, and waiting. Thomas Rainer is not a man who snapped. He's a man who studied silence until he became its author. The defense simply replied, no eyewitness, no confession, no camera showing him at the scene. All you have is suggestion, possibility, not proof. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the room stood still. Guilty on all counts. 3 confirmed murders. 1 charge pending. And as the judge read the sentence, life without parole, Thomas finally turned his head. He looked not at the judge, not at the victims' families, but at a young ranger seated in the second row, the one who had helped find the maps. Thomas nodded, as if passing a torch. The sentence was supposed to be the end. But the forest has one last secret. Because just weeks after the trial, a wildfire burned through the old Skybridge area. And when the smoke cleared, a new trail was exposed. A trail that had never been marked on any map, except one, in red ink, with an X. The fire was accidental. At least, that's what the report said. Lightning had struck a dead pine near the abandoned Skybridge Fire Lookout, where no ranger had patrolled in over a decade. The blaze lasted less than 3 hours, small, contained by recent rains, but it did something no one expected. It peeled back the forest skin, and what it revealed changed the case forever. When the smoke cleared, a team of state investigators was dispatched to assess the damage. They weren't looking for evidence. They were just confirming structural hazards. But then someone spotted it. A line of flat stones, arranged deliberately in the shape of an arrow. It pointed downhill, toward a stretch of underbrush that had never appeared on forest maps. And at the end of that path was a trapdoor, wooden, half-rotted, camouflaged with soil and moss. It creaked when lifted, and underneath was a root cellar, or what looked like one. What it actually was, no one was prepared for. Inside, the air was wet and heavy. Condensation dripped from a pipe overhead, suggesting someone had once rigged the ceiling to divert rainwater away from the roof above. There were shelves, homemade, nailed together from what looked like park signage. The walls had been reinforced with stone, and a single bulb hung from a rusted hook, its wire trailing up toward the surface. But the light didn't work. No electricity. No generator. Still, someone had lived there, or at least used it. And carved into the far wall, barely visible through mildew and soot, were 6 words. They never look in winter. When forensic teams descended on the site, they cataloged everything. 1 steel chair bolted to the ground. Chains on the wall, 2, not 1. A child's coat, size 6T, discolored with age. And in the far back corner, beneath a pile of stones, they found what they feared most. Bones. Not a complete skeleton, but enough to identify a young female, likely under 10 years old. There was no match in any missing persons database. Not yet, but investigators now believe the scope of Thomas Rayner's crimes, or at least the forest secrets, were far bigger than they'd ever imagined. When confronted with a new discovery, Thomas didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge the images of the child's coat or the cellar. But when shown a close-up of the 6 words carved into the wall, he finally said something. It was true. Just that. It was true. And when pressed, he added, "He told me that." The first time. The interview was immediately sealed. Because suddenly, the case was no longer about one man. It was about 2. Someone older. Someone who came first. A ghost hiding in the woods long before Thomas took up his role. And that ghost had a name. In 2003, a park ranger named Caleb Holt vanished during a routine patrol. He was in his 50s. Experience. Knew every ridge, every trailhead. His disappearance was written off as an accident. Bear attack, perhaps. A fall into a ravine. Search teams found his truck, but no body, no blood, nothing. The forest simply took him, they said. But in one of Thomas's recovered journals, map number 3, page 6, there was a note scribbled in the margins. "She showed me the chimney. Said he used it for birds first, then something else." See, Caleb, a ranger, a guide, a ghost. The FBI reopened Caleb Holt's file, and then they found it, buried in the archives of a long-forgotten report. In 1991, Caleb had filed an internal memo claiming he found a hunter's trap filled with bones near an off-grid shelter. No one followed up. The area was inaccessible due to winter conditions, and the report was shelved. But now, in light of the cellar and the 6 chilling words, it read like a confession disguised as a warning. What if Caleb wasn't just a ranger? What if he was the first to use the forest this way? What if Thomas was a student? In one final attempt to extract information, the lead profiler visited Thomas in prison. She brought no files, no maps, just a blank piece of paper. She handed it to him and said, "Show me where the others are." Thomas looked at the paper for a long time. Then, slowly, he drew a line. It wasn't a trail, not at first glance. It was an hourglass, and at the bottom, an X. No words, no names, just a shape. The profiler asked him what it meant. He smiled, a dry, cracked smile that hadn't been seen since the day of his arrest. "You're running out of time." Back in town, the locals still avoid the Skybridge trails. Hikers whisper about the maps. Campers warn newcomers about certain sounds at night. whistling like a kettle, though no one brings stoves that far out anymore. And every year, around the fire's anniversary, something strange happens. Small piles of stones appear near trail markers, each pile shaped like an arrow, pointing nowhere, or maybe pointing to what's still buried. Thomas Rayner died in custody 8 months later. Official cause, stroke, but the day before he died, he was seen scribbling on the wall of his cell with a paper clip. They never figured out what it said, because by the time guards entered, the writing had been scratched out, not by him, but by someone else, another inmate who claimed he'd never met Thomas, but somehow knew he wasn't the only one. In the years that followed, hikers began referring to that stretch of woods as the Ledger's Edge, where maps end and memory begins. The case remains technically closed, but for those who saw the drawings, those who touched the dirt above the trapdoor, and those who heard Thomas whisper in the dark, it's not over. The forest still keeps score, and every time the wind shifts, it writes one more line. The first whisper of identification came not from a detective's hunch or a family member's plea, but from the sterile hum of a forensic lab. After the discovery in the woods, Veronica's shredded tank top, her running shoes knotted together like a cruel trophy, and the zip tie half buried near her necklace, the evidence was sealed and shipped for analysis. Napa County had long since handed the case off to state-level authorities. The local station simply didn't have the resources to chase ghosts. But now, those ghosts were starting to scream. DNA pulled from the sweat-crusted inner lining of the tank top yielded partial male DNA. It wasn't enough to rush a suspect, but it was enough to upload into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. For weeks, nothing. And then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, a hit. The name, Mark Jennings. A 41-year-old man from Antioch, just 2 hours from Napa. A previous offender. Minor charges. Nothing violent. Trespassing, unlawful surveillance. A dismissed restraining order from a woman who said he was watching her run at the park too often. Back then, the charges hadn't stuck. Now they did. Detectives dug deeper. His work history was spotty. Odd jobs in IT, some contract gigs with state parks. A blurry image emerged. A man who knew the trails, knew when they were empty, and liked to be alone in places most people feared getting lost. They obtained a warrant for his digital footprint, and what they found was deliberate. Jennings had subscribed to Veronica's old YouTube fitness channel under an alias. Her Instagram posts, many of which featured her trail routes and sunrise schedules, had been saved. He commented once on a post from 6 months before her disappearance. It was subtle, almost benign. Those trails are lucky to have you. But context transformed it into something grotesque. The investigators pulled cell phone tower pings. On the morning of Veronica's disappearance, his phone had been off. Dead zone. No pings. But 2 hours later, a tower picked up his device reactivated near a gas station 15 miles from the trailhead. Still circumstantial. Until they found the storage unit. Hidden under his brother's name, it was a 5x10 locker near Martinez. Inside, plastic bins, photographs, and a black composition notebook. Veronica's name was written on the cover, along with others. The photographs were chilling. Some were from public events, running meets, community marathons. Others were taken without consent. Long lens shots through brush. Veronica tying her laces. Veronica sipping water by her car. Veronica pausing mid-run, stretching beside a tree. Unaware, alone, she had been watched. Not once, not by chance, but methodically and for months. Detectives brought in his neighbors. One remembered seeing Jennings return home the morning Veronica vanished, mud on his boots, sweating, but not from exertion. Another neighbor mentioned his tendency to sit in his car late at night, just idling. One woman recalled him fixing an old camera rig to the front porch of his duplex. He told her it was to watch for package thieves. Now, she wondered who was really being watched. Jennings was placed under surveillance. 2 unmarked cars tracked his movements. For days, he barely left home. Then, one evening, he drove to a remote overlook at Lake Berryessa, alone, and stayed in his car for over an hour, just staring. The task force worried he might run, or worse, destroy something. They made the call. On a gray morning in April, SWAT surrounded his duplex. He opened the door without a fight, asked only one question: "Is this about the girl?" Inside his apartment, they found even more damning evidence. A laptop with encrypted folders, one labeled Morning Stars. Inside, dozens of photographs and coordinates. Veronica's trailhead was just one of many. She had not been the only one watched, but she had been the only one taken. Jennings was charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and first-degree murder, though the prosecution faced a hurdle. Veronica's body had not been found. Yet, the Truffle pig's discovery had set the wheels in motion. The deeper law enforcement dug, the more they found, and the more they began to suspect. Veronica's disappearance wasn't just an isolated act of obsession. It was part of a pattern, a method, and Mark Jennings had been walking that pattern long before anyone noticed. So far, if the story has made you unsettled, good. We're only beginning to scratch the surface. Subscribe now and tap the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Meanwhile, let's uncover a trail no one was supposed to find, and the person who walked it before anyone else disappeared. Stay close. The forest isn't finished. Mark Jennings sat across from the lead detective with the same vacant expression he wore the day they cuffed him. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't fear. It was something worse, emptiness, as though all the emotion had long since been scrubbed clean, leaving behind a man who no longer believed in guilt or innocence, just silence. He didn't ask for a lawyer right away, didn't deny knowing Veronica, didn't speak until they slid a photo across the table, one of the long lens shots found in his locker. Veronica, mid-stride on a redwood loop, arms lifted in rhythm, face turned toward the sun. "I used to watch her run," he said softly. "She always looked free." It wasn't a confession, not legally, but it was a crack. And from that crack, the dam began to leak. The investigators pressed forward, carefully. They had enough to hold him, but not enough to bury him. Veronica's body was still missing. The DA needed concrete, something beyond creepy photos and trailhead pings. They needed motive, opportunity, a location, and a story. Jennings gave them fragments, out of order, abstract, like someone recalling a dream they weren't sure they lived. He spoke about patterns in the woods, paths people aren't meant to walk, and how some people don't even know they're being followed until it's far too late. He was trying to sound philosophical, but the files on his hard drive told a different story. One folder stood out. Hidden behind layers of innocuous PDFs was a digital diary. Entries dated, time-stamped, and meticulously organized. Some described observations. Others chronicled internal thoughts, cataloging Veronica's routines in obsessive detail. There were references to trials, thresholds, and a recurring phrase that chilled even the seasoned investigators. One must be taken to make the others see. What others? Was he part of something bigger? The team turned to behavioral analysts, profilers who'd spent decades digging to the minds of serial offenders. The verdict was consistent. Jennings wasn't acting on impulse. He wasn't mentally unstable in the traditional sense. He was performing, crafting a narrative for himself where he wasn't a predator, but a messenger, a distorted kind of savior. And in that self-made mythology, Veronica wasn't a victim. She was a sacrifice. Someone chosen, watched, prepared, and finally taken. But how? Where? The answer came not from Jennings, but from soil. Investigators returned to the discovery site, the place where the Truffle pig had dug, and began excavating more methodically. They widened the perimeter, removing 6 inches of topsoil, then scanning beneath with ground-penetrating radar. They found a void. 3 feet down, tucked beneath a natural shelf of limestone, was what appeared to be an old emergency fire shelter, a relic from Forest Service days long gone. Inside, bones, charred, wrapped in what looked like aluminum. Forensics took over. 2 weeks later, the coroner confirmed the worst. The remains were Veronica's. A hairbrush from her apartment provided the DNA match. Dental records sealed it. Her jaw had been fractured, her left tibia snapped. But she hadn't died from blunt force or fall. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Manual, slow. She had fought, and for a while, she had lived. Long enough for her killer to drag her to the underground fire shelter. Long enough for him to think she'd never be found. Jennings was re-interviewed, presented with the evidence. He didn't cry, didn't even blink, just leaned forward and whispered, she was supposed to be the first. The team froze. The first? The implications hit like thunder. There were more folders, more photos, more women. The pattern was expanding. Some of the images weren't even from California. A few were from Oregon, one from Washington, another taken from a rest stop in Idaho. Were these more victims? Or targets who escaped without ever knowing they were marked? The FBI joined the task force. Interagency files were reviewed. Cold cases reopened. Tips followed. For the first time in years, a new cluster of missing women, mostly runners, hikers, and solo trailgoers, were placed on a unified board. One thread kept appearing. Remote trails, early mornings, no witnesses, and a sense of being watched. Jennings was either a one-time killer who spiraled into obsession, or he was part of something darker. And someone out there might still be watching. Meanwhile, the DA prepared the case for trial. Jennings' defense was weak. A public defender floated the idea of mental instability. The judge denied it. The evidence was overwhelming. Jennings was ruled competent. The prosecution announced their intent to seek life without parole. But it didn't feel like closure. Not to Veronica's mother, who sat in the front row during every hearing, clutching the hairband her daughter used to wear when she jogged. Not to the retired chef, whose pig had unknowingly pulled back the curtain on a hidden horror. And not to the public, who now understood how fragile safety really is. Veronica was a runner, a marathoner, a person of routine, a creature of sunlight and early trails and quiet strength. And someone out there had taken all of that, not out of rage or jealousy or even lust, but out of a desired control, to possess, to extinguish something they could never become. As we draw to a close, we've cracked the mask, but what's behind it goes deeper than anyone imagined. The question now isn't just, what did Mark Jennings do? It's, how many others were meant to disappear? And who else knew? The verdict came down on a rain-soaked Thursday morning. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no gasping crowd or sobbing confession. Mark Jennings simply bowed his head, almost in relief, like a man who had waited years to be told what he already believed, that he was never walking free again. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end there, because something still didn't add up. After the trial, detectives began dismantling the storage unit Jennings had quietly rented under a false name an hour outside Napa. It had been used for years, filled with boxes, handwritten journals, wildlife cameras, topographic maps, and weather-warped trail guides from across the West. One item sat in the far back corner, a hunter's backpack, faded and torn. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a locket, engraved with the name Riley. The problem? Riley wasn't Veronica. She was someone else entirely. A name not tied to case, not tied to Jennings, not listed among the California missing persons. Until the FBI dug deeper. Riley Marks, 21, vanished in Washington State 6 years earlier on a solo backpacking trip through Olympic National Park. Her case had gone cold within months, ruled a likely accident due to treacherous terrain and sudden snowfall. Her body had never been recovered, and Mark Jennings had never been connected. Until now, when they reopened her file, something stuck out. One of her last photos posted online was taken from the trailhead. A blurry figure stood in the tree line behind her. Investigators hadn't missed it before. Now, with facial enhancement and comparison, they were sure it was him. Mark Jennings had been stalking for years, long before Veronica, long before Napa. The locket wasn't a trophy. It was a timeline. And Riley wasn't the only marker. As agents combed through his journals, more names surfaced, some first names only. Amelia, Tessa, Lydia, each paired with coordinates. Some entries were vague, poetic, others disturbingly detailed. Amelia runs before sunrise. Dog waits at the bend. She leaves a trail for 7 minutes at mile 3 to stretch by the creek. Vulnerable moment. Lydia hums while walking, doesn't check behind her, doesn't suspect. The implication was chilling. These weren't just observations. They were blueprints. Jennings wasn't reacting to fantasy. He was orchestrating it, mapping out habits, testing boundaries, watching lives like chapters in a story he controlled. And he might not have worked alone. A second name appeared repeatedly across his notes. S. No last name. No direct context. Just S advised. S says observe longer. S will confirm. It could have been nothing, but the digital trail said otherwise. In encrypted folders on his hard drive, agents found emails from a masked account, routing through multiple servers. Each message brief, clinical, often containing attachments like drone footage or annotated maps. One simply read, "Don't engage yet. Patience is part of the discipline." Jennings wasn't just a predator. He was a student. And somewhere out there, someone else had been instructing him. That's when the story took its darkest turn. 2 months after his conviction, a second storage unit was found. Not in California, but Idaho, rented under yet another alias. Inside, hiking gear, a burner phone, and a list, 23 names. Some marked with a red X, others not. The XS match confirmed victims, women who'd vanished in wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest. But the unchecked names? Some were still alive, still out there, unaware their names had ever been written by a man like Jennings. The FBI launched a coordinated notification program, contacting each woman discreetly. Some were horrified. Others remembered small things, a man in a park, a car in their rear view, a stranger who looked just a little too familiar. The nightmare wasn't over, and for some it was just beginning. Meanwhile, in prison, Jennings stopped speaking entirely. No more cryptic phrases. No more monologues about paths and sacrifices. He just stared. Sometimes, when guards passed his cell at night, they found him standing silently, facing the wall, as though listening for something only he could hear. An echo from the woods, a whisper he still believed in. Back in Napa, the trail where Veronica ran was unofficially renamed by the local community. They called it Veronica's Run, not in celebration, but in warning. The marker stands near the head of the path. Beneath it reads, "She ran with purpose." He followed with silence. We remember. We watch. We don't forget. But the question still haunts everyone who followed the case. Was Mark Jennings ever truly alone? Or was there an entire web? Watchers, wanderers, people who hide behind trail maps and camera lenses, sharing notes in the shadows? That question remains unanswered. And maybe that's what keeps people awake. Because in national parks across the U.S., hikers still vanish without a trace. And not every forest gives its secrets back. If this story gripped you, there's more coming. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. This trail may be ending, but the wilderness, it never sleeps. And neither do those who walk it in the dark.